Hello everyone, today we consider learning Python and today I'll write some good code using Python. So let's start. Once again, today I'll write some good code using Python and that video is not for the beginners. So if you just started with Python, then maybe that video is not for you. So you can come back to it later, but maybe you can take some things from it, but you will not get everything. But if you are intermediate developer in Python or even advanced one, then that video will help you to write good code because lots of people don't really see the potential problems with different parts of their application. And today I'll just write a simple program. So let me just explain what it does. Our program will get the username and the password from our user, from our customer, and if the username and the password will be found in a simple text file of format username, semicolon, password. So for example, Andrew, semicolon, password, 123. So if our user writes Andrew as the username and password 123 as his password, then we will say like you are logged in, everything is alright. But otherwise we will say sorry, wrong password or invalid username, something like that. So very simple program, and I'm sure that all of you can write it easily because, as I said, you are intermediate or advanced developers in Python, or even maybe you're beginners but you know some basics. But now let's write it with some good code. So what do I mean by good code? I'll explain every step, but I'm not really sure that every step will be correct for every application. So what do I mean by that? For every application, for every use case, and for every time period, there are different ideas or different solutions for writing good code. So for some applications, when you really need to write quick code, the better code or the best code even is the code that will just work. But for other applications, when you require like really good code, the best code is the code that works with all of the norms, with all of the rules, and which uses it. Hello everyone, my name is Andrew. Today we'll continue learning Python, and today I will show you how to write some good code using Python. So let's start. First of all, what I want to say is that video is not for beginners in Python. So if you just started with programming with Python, then that video is maybe not for you. If you worked with other languages and just started with Python, then of course you can watch it because you can apply those rules in any language of your choice. And I'm making that video because recently, like a month ago, I made a course on Udemy. You can find it in the link down below, which explains you how to write good code. And that example is one of those from the course. And I will show you how to write some good code and we'll write a simple program in Python. So what that program will do? We'll have a simple application that will allow our users to write their username and their password. Username, password. And also we'll have a text file that contains those usernames and password. For example, Andrew123, password 123. So Andrew123 is the username and password 123 is the password. If you worked with tpc-ip, or actually I forgot, no, passvd. So there is a file format in Linux in almost any application that requires passwords and usernames to be stored in a text file that implies that format. So you have your username and then your hashed password. In some applications it's not hashed, but typically nowadays every password is hashed one. So if you don't know about hashes, if you don't know why we hash passwords, don't worry. I also have a video on that, but yeah, you just have your files where you have your usernames and your passwords. That's it. And our program will allow our users to write their username, their password, and if those passwords and usernames correspond with each other, so if we found the match, then we say to our user that everything is alright, so you are logged in. But otherwise we say that sorry, I could not find your password and your username. So something is wrong, try again. Something like that. So that will be our program. As you can see, it's fairly simple because I'm sure that everybody can write that program, but I will show you how to write it with some good code. And let's just start. The first thing that I want to do is look at my application. So look what I have right now. The only thing that I have is main.py file. And of course I will not write all of my code inside of that file. But what I want to do is write a simple main function. So that main function let's just put if name equals main, and let's just call main function here. So what is that? In Python, we can import different files to other files. So we can import some modules to other files. For example, if I'm writing from math import cosinus or cosinus, or how do you call it, cos. Yeah, from math import cos. What I have here is I have a module. In our case, module is math. And if you want to ensure that our users will run our main.py file using Python main.py command, so really run that specific file, we will not import that file to another. Then we need to write that if case. So what it does is simply it tells us if the name of our file and the name of our file is a variable, so that variable, the first one, which tells us what is the unique name for our file. If we import that file, so if I would have a file, for example, abc.py, and I would write from main.py import main function or import main, like that, then my name variable for that main file, again main.py file, will be different. But if we run our file directly, so if I would really just like go here, run main.py, then our name variable will be equal to _main_. So that if case really tells you if your file was run directly. And yeah, that's the only reason to use it, and that is a very, very good code, because it shows you, or it ensures that you will only run all of your logic if your file is ran directly. So yeah, otherwise you just have function definitions, class definitions, and other code. But if your file is run directly, then you run all of the logic that should be ran as a separate Python program. Okay, so now I have defined main function, and what I need to do here is, again, the first thing that I need to do in my program is ask for the user password and for the username. So username equals input and password equals input. But actually we cannot do that. So why we cannot do that? Because imagine that in 10 days or in 5 months, our program will skyrocket. So we will have lots of users who will want to change the the same program for their mobile phones. Or what if we want to change input function to another function? So what if I have like my input function, something like that? What if I want to change the way of our user information handling? What if I want to have some validators? I cannot do that here because I'm like really using input function from Python. I'm directly using that input function, and what it does, what that code does to me is it has some dependencies that I cannot resolve easily if my code grows. So if your code grows and you have like tons of those inputs, tons of prints, as we also need to write the information or to show the information to the user, we will need to use print function. And if you have tons of those, then as your code grows, the more harder for you it will be to change all the dependencies of your direct function calls. So I cannot easily change input to another function. Of course I can do it here, but imagine that you multiply that code by 100. So you have 100 inputs, 100 prints, and then it would not be as easy. Still, you can just use Ctrl+Shift+R in PyCharm on Ctrl+Shift+H in Visual Studio Code and just change all of your input and print functions. But still, we want to really remove all the dependencies of our code. And to do that, what I can do is create another file which will be called user interface. Like that. Here, what I can do is create a class called user interface. And now in main, instead of writing like input and print directly, I can import that user interface class from my user interface.py file. And what I can do here is, first of all, create that user interface, user interface equals user interface. And I wanted to call it UI, but I thought that UI is not a very, very great name for the variable. Why? Because UI does not explain everything. So maybe UI is a great way, it's a really philosophical question. maybe UI is a great name for the variable, but I feel that user interface is much more descriptive. So it literally is the same. So if you don't know, UI is a shortened version of user interface. But as for me, user interface is the way to go because I want to ensure that all of my variables are very, very descriptive, or rather all of my variable names are very, very descriptive. And what I can do instead of input is just simply write user interface dot input. And here, once again, user interface dot input. Of course, what I need to do then is go to user interface class and write that function input somewhere here. Okay, so now as you can see, user interface dot input, user interface dot input right here. And what we can do now? Now we can head back to user interface dot py class, and instead of just using define input and putting pass here, what I can do is return my input function. And as you may saw, or as you know, input has a prompt. So prompt is like what you want to show if you require an input from the user, something like that. And again, what we can do here is write some, for example, write your username, write some hints, and here write your password. And of course, what I need to do then is accept that hint, let me call it hint, in my input function. But also what I need to do is actually apply I forgot how it's called. Apply annotation. Yeah, apply an annotation. So what is an annotation? Annotation is a way for you to show the type of your variable. It's a really, really philosophical topic, once again, because now annotations are really work like validators in Python. And I talked about that in one of my previous videos, which was about Python 3.10, the newest version of Python. But now what we want to do, or what we want to use annotations for, is to show that hint should be a string. So because hint is like a string, we cannot provide an integer here. So why is that beneficial? Because now our users know that, okay, I need to provide hint as a string. Now our programmers know that, okay, hint as a string. And what we can do here is just simply put hint somewhere here. But actually it's not, maybe it's not the right way. Now it depends. And that video, as you may already know, is really philosophical as well. Yeah, everything is philosophical. We are philosophers, not programmers. So in some cases, it's beneficial to put hint directly inside of input. But in other cases, what we want to do is go to main.py and see that we have input, and we would also want to have some output. So I'll call it output. And what I can do here, output, like that. What I want to do here is accept some data, which will also be string, and I just want to print that data here. But if we're talking about input, I think that it's much more beneficial for us to simply use self-output with hint here. So data equals hint. Why is that? Because if we're using self-output, imagine that we want to change print to something else. If I would use return input here and just simply write hint as the argument of input function, then I would not be able to change my output as easily as it would change it with self-output. So now, as you can see, we simply remove all the dependencies and we shrink all the dependencies to simply one function. So if we want to use input, that is only in one function, so that input function. And if I would ever need to change that function to another one, what I can do is simply go here and change that input to my input, for example. And then every part of my program will use that input in it. The same goes for output, because if I want to change the way we output our information, so I want to add like fancy things before, let's add some lines before and some lines after the information, so something like that. Then what I can do is simply use output, because every function does not use print directly, it uses output. And if I want to change print, I just can simply change it here. So that is, from my point of view, the way to go for that code. And actually it's really, really philosophical as well, because if you are talking about print, then, or if you're talking about the arguments, then maybe we want to change, or maybe we want to not have strings as our data, because in some case scenarios, we want to output dictionaries in Python. In some cases, we want to output JSON, XML, or other type of information. And it really depends. But for now, we can stick with strings because we are not talking about very complicated programs. We will talk about a simple Python program. And also what I can do here is return a string. So that is another annotation that will show you, okay, we need to return string as the result. Because again, input returns a string. And now we are simply done with our program. So let's just output, f string, username, password, like that. Let's run it, write your username, and as you can see right now, I have all of my fancy decorations for my text, because I'm using self-output function inside of input. Now let's write our username, for example, Andrew, and write your password 123. As you can see, we have Andrew password 123, so everything works from that part. And yeah, that is simply the very good code that we can write. Also, what we want to add is O, like that. O user interface. So what is O? In that case, we can go without O, but if I would have some functions that should never be used by a user directly, for example, function, I don't know, my debug function, like that, then O would be a perfect addition, because O array, so as you can see it's an array, shows what objects are public, so what objects should you import to other modules. So in our case we can import user interface without a problem, but if I have, or if I would have a very internal object or a very internal class, function, whatever, then I cannot put it in O, and it would be easier for other programmers to see that, okay, we can import user interface, but we can't import something else, which is for debug or internal purposes only. But in our case, we can omit that O, but I will just leave it so you can see it. And now we created our username and our password. What we need to do next? Next, we need to really talk about the logic. So let's create another Python file, which is called, which will be called, I don't know, maybe just call it logic. No, logic is not a great name, and we're writing the best code of our lives. So what we need to do is actually think about the name of the file. So what we need to call it. In our case, what we want to do in that file is simply get the username and the password and put those usernames and passwords to another class that will work with the data source. So in our case, what I can think of is just services. Alright, we call it else logic, like that. So else logic, what is that? Else logic will have another class else logic, which will have defined login function. So login function will accept username as a string and password as a string, and it would return true, or it would return boolean. So what login function will do? Login function will accept username of our user and password of our user, and if everything's alright, so if username and passwords match, then we would just return true, otherwise false. So that's how it works. Let's go to main.py, and here instead of user interface output, because we don't want to output anything yet, what we can do is simply use else logic. So from else logic import else logic. We can create it here. So else logic equals else logic, and typically it's better to write better names, but yeah, typically it's better to write better name, whatever, repetitions, but else logic is not the perfect name. What I mean by that is that, okay, it describes the name of the variable, we know what it does, but typically I think else services or else something else, it would be better. So it's just my point of view, and I cannot really give the name of the variable some really meaningful name, because that program is like a very concealed one, so we cannot see any further. So what I mean by that is that I'm writing that program and I don't know what it does, what it will do. But if we're talking about like user authentication system, that what we can do is instead of auth logic, we can write user logic or user services. Auth logic is once again alright, but it could be better. So you always need to think about the names of your functions. So once again, we're using auth logic here, and what we can do is use auth logic dot login username equals username password equals password. So username and password, as you can see, I put username equals username and password equals password. The most or the single baddest mistake in any code, in any programming language from my point of view, is not giving the names for your function arguments. So what do I mean by that? If I would just put username and password here, then okay, you understand that, okay, username is maybe a username, password is maybe a password. But what if instead of username, I'm choosing like information from user? So what if I cannot really tell I cannot really tell by the variable name, so in our case by username or password, what that function or what that variable will be about. And I think that in 99% of the cases, it's better to provide the names of your arguments, using named arguments instead of like normal ones, instead of like just username, because from my point of view it's just easier. So everybody then says, okay, username corresponds with the username argument. So in our case, as you can see, it's really easy to distinguish like passwords from username, because literally our variables are called username and password. But still, I think that it would be beneficial for us to really use named arguments. Okay, so as you can see, we don't use them here, but we can still do it. But I'm not really sure if we need to, because we only have one argument in here. But if I would append other arguments like hint, new line, API version, notify user or something else in our input function, then I of course need to put hint equals. But in our case, since we only have one argument, we can just put the value itself. But in login function, when we have two arguments, I think that it's beneficial to put names for those arguments, as well as the variable, names for those arguments. So just username equals username, password equals password. Okay, so here else logic, what it does. First of all, else logic, let's write all once again. Else logic here. And login function, once again, will get username and password and will return boolean. So actually, login function is really a proxy function. So what do I mean by that? Login function can run some validations. Of course, we can run some validations. So if username and password, and then pass, else, raise exception, or raise value error, username and password must exist. So as you can see here, I'm running some validations, but actually it's better to run those validations in a separate function, in a separate method. So somewhere here, define validate login, something like that. We still provide username as a string, password as a string, and we return boolean once again. So here we return true, here we return nothing, but we return typically false. So as you can see, if we have username and our password, we return true, else we raise our value error. And what can I do inside the login function is called self-validate login. So once again, username equals username, password equals password, like that. And that's just it. We can actually not return boolean at all, because what I can do is, instead of using that if else, what I can do is use if not username or not password. So if we don't have either username or password, we raise value error, username and password must exist. So now, as you can see, everything works all right. And why did I split my function in other? So why did I split validation in another function? In some cases, it's even better to split validation in different classes, because as you can see, validation, we can't split validation, because if I would ever need to change it, I only need to change that one function once again. But also it really it really splits the logic into different layers. So now I have login function that really calls self-validate login, and we don't interfere with the logic of login function, or we don't really insert the logic of validation inside of login function. We only say that you need to validate it But how you validate it is your login function is not responsible for validation. It's only responsible for validation function call. So we only call that function and it validates it somewhere here. So that's how it works from my point of view. And that's why splitting those functions are better. So we split it here, we don't see validation logic here, and if we would ever need to change it, of course I can go here and change it directly. But now what we need to do is actually put our username and password to some kind of a database. And of course, what we need to do is call another file or create another file, database. Let's create another file called class database, or actually let's call it user database, because user database really describes that we work with users. Once again, I'll write all equals to user database. And here what we can do is define find user by, or let's just write find user, because I don't want to give really long names, but find user, and we need to provide username, and we need to provide username password pair as a string. So what we are doing here we have username password pair, and we have our logic here. Find user, what that function will do? It will simply open the file. So open, of course, once again, what we can do is use pass. We can use class database that will create our open file. So we can really split those open into different functions. So yeah, we can literally just write file.txt right here and write somewhere here. But I will not do that because that video is already kind of long. I don't know how much or how many minutes passed. 28 minutes. Oh my god. But yeah, what you should do here is really open that file in another class. But user database, what it will do? It will accept user password pair, and it will read from that file. Of course, read. Let me just read lines, and for every line, so let me just for line in like that, and not for line but for username or for user credentials like that. If user credentials equals to username password pair, username password pair, then we return true, but else we return false. So what we are doing right here, user database is a simple class that will open a file and it will read lines from that file. So once again, if you want to really write some good code, you need to split that function in a different file. So create database or database connection and put that open in that database connection, put that read lines as a separate function, but I would not do that because I don't have enough time. But yeah, so user credentials is every line of our username password file. But what I actually need to do that is use replace /n to nothing, because for Python it's not for every language, but for Python, when you are using readlines function, then you always have /n at the end. And if you want to really check if your username and password pair are the same as your user credentials, you just need to remove that last /n. So yeah, you return true here and you return false here. If you found a user, you return true, else you return false. Of course, we need to put annotation here, so by arrow. And now what we can do is use user database here. So let me just import it from database, import user database, and let me just use user database dot find user by username password pair, and that username password pair is simply username password, password like that. And what we can do in addition is just simply write return here. So that is the simple perfect code that we can write. Well, it's not perfect because there are still some things that we need to talk about, because login, I think, it works because we literally return true or false. So is logged, is logged or let me just write logged is authenticated, like that. So if our user is authenticated, what we can do is, if is authenticated, we can use user interface. Don't forget about that class. Output, you are authenticated. Like that. Or else, user interface, output, wrong password or username, like that. So that is the most simple perfect code that we can write. So now what we have, the user interface is the class that allows us to talk to the users, which allows us to work with the user interface. We have auth logic class that allows us to work with the logic of our program, so that is our business logic. And we have our user database, which allows us to work with the data source. That is the most simple case scenario. I'm not sure if it will work right now. Let me just test it, because yeah, I just wrote that code like literally just text.txt literally with you. And let me just put Andrew password 123. Let me just put some for example Tom 123, and yeah, let me just put that. So let's run our code. Write your username. Let me write Andrew. Write your password 123. No such file directory, file.txt. Yeah, because here we need to put text.txt. Let's run again. Andrew, password 123. You are authenticated. Let me write it again, for example, like that. Wrong password or username. So as you can see, that is a very simple program, but it took us 4 files and 4 different classes, well, 3 different classes to write it. And actually there are lots of things that I need to talk about in the future, if you want me to continue working with that program, because still it's not perfect. It's really, we have different opinions on like username password pair, because we simply provide the username, but well, maybe we need to construct that username password pair inside of one user. Yeah, maybe that is the case. I think that is the case. What about open? What about I don't know, what about other things like what? I had a thing here. Oh, I forgot about it. I'm sorry, I forgot about, oh yeah, what about raise value error? So what we need to do with that? Actually, raise value error is pretty simple. We just need to put try here. We need to put except here. We need to put value error here as exception, and then we can use user interface output exception. But you need to really be cautious. You really need to be cautious with that, because it can lead to some serious problems, because you really output the exception. But expected type string code, yeah, you need to provide password and username. So as you can see, that program is pretty perfect, but it's not perfect, it's not ideal, because no program is ideal. And yeah, still there are lots of things that we need to talk about, because what if we have different first of all, we need to talk about database layer, because I think that is a very bad database layer. So we need to form that user password pair here. Of course, open should be in a different class. Auth logic should be, well, auth logic is kind of nice, but yeah, still there are some additions that we may add to it. We need to have our own exceptions if we want. We may have our own exceptions. We need to use logging. We need to use settings. And actually all of that information is in my course. So yeah, as you can see, we wrote a very perfect program. But if you want me to continue working with that program, you can just write it down in the comments below. But if you want to get the information instantly, or if you want me to talk about why we need to write that program like that, what is the benefit and what is the cost of writing our program in that manner, then of course go to my course, and yeah, you'll just see it, why we need to do that. So I explained everything inside of my course, so it's called How to Write Perfect Code as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, that's just it. So that is, from my point of view, a very cool code. It can be a very contradictive for some people, but yeah, that is the topic that I want to discuss next, if you of course want me to continue working with that program. So write that down in the comments. And as for me, thank you. Subscribe to my channel, leave a like, leave a comment, and good luck.